Behind the golden gates and manicured gardens of Britain's most privileged estates lies a story that's shaking the very foundations of the monarchy. A story about power, poverty, and a question that's making headlines around the world. Can a king truly serve his people while others suffer on land he owns? This is the story of King Charles III, a man who became monarch promising compassion and duty. But today, he faces accusations that threaten to tarnish his crown forever. What's happening on royal land? Why are people calling it inhumane? And how did the king, a man known for his environmental activism and charity work, find himself at the center of this scandal? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the British monarchy. May 6, 2023. The world watched as Charles Philip Arthur George was crowned King Charles III in Westminster Abbey. It was a ceremony 70 years in the making. At 74 years old, he finally inherited the throne his mother held for a lifetime. But Charles wasn't just inheriting a crown. He was inheriting an empire of land and wealth that most of us can barely comprehend. The Crown Estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, the Duchy of Cornwall. Together, these holdings span over 780,000 acres across Britain. That's more than 1,200 square miles of prime real estate, farms, forests, and coastline. The annual revenue? Over £1 billion. Charles has spent decades cultivating an image of a caring, progressive royal. He's championed organic farming, spoken passionately about climate change, and supported countless charities. He's the prince, now king, who talks to his plants, who warns about environmental catastrophe, who claims to care deeply about the vulnerable. But something's been happening on his land, something that contradicts everything he claims to stand for. And when the truth came out, Britain and the world erupted in outrage. It started with a leak. Internal documents, witness testimonies. Journalists from The Guardian and Channel 4's dispatches began piecing together a disturbing picture. On estates owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, land that generated millions for Charles before he became king and now belongs to Prince William, families were living in conditions that human rights advocates called inhumane and Victorian. Let me paint you a picture of what they found. Homes infested with black mold so severe that children were developing respiratory problems. Buildings with crumbling walls, dangerous electrical wiring, and broken heating systems that left elderly tenants shivering through British winters. Raw sewage backing up into bathrooms. Leaking roofs that went unrepaired for months, sometimes years. One mother reported that her young son's asthma had become so severe from the mold in their duchy-owned flat that he'd been hospitalized 3 times. She'd sent dozens of repair requests. Most went unanswered. An elderly veteran living in Cornwall described his rental property as unfit for animals, let alone humans. The roof leaked so badly he had to put buckets in every room when it rained. But here's what made this story explosive. These weren't isolated incidents. Investigators found a pattern across multiple properties and multiple regions. The Duchy of Cornwall, despite collecting millions in rent annually, had allegedly neglected basic maintenance and habitability standards for years. And there's more. When tenants complained, some reported facing intimidation tactics, threats of eviction, legal pressure to stay quiet. One family told reporters they were afraid to speak publicly, fearing they'd lose their home entirely. The Duchy of Cornwall, the investigation revealed, was operating like an absentee slum landlord, extracting profit while people suffered. And all of this was happening while Charles spoke eloquently about compassion, sustainability, and caring for communities. When the investigation aired in November 2023, the reaction was immediate and furious. Social media exploded. #NotMyKing began trending alongside #RoyalSlumlord. Outside Buckingham Palace, protesters gathered with signs reading Charles, "Fix your properties and inhumane treatment on royal land." But this wasn't just angry tweets and street protests. This was a genuine crisis for the monarchy's reputation. Members of Parliament called for investigations. Opposition leaders demanded Charles personally address the allegations. Housing charities that had previously enjoyed royal patronage issued stinging statements expressing deep disappointment and concern. One MP stood in the House of Commons and said something that sent shockwaves through the establishment. How can we ask landlords across Britain to meet basic housing standards when our own head of state profits from properties that allegedly violate those very standards? The tabloids, usually deferential to royalty, turned vicious. The king's slums. Royal tenants living in misery. Charles's compassion, where is it now? Anti-monarchy groups, which had been gaining momentum since Queen Elizabeth's death, seized the moment. Republic, Britain's main anti-monarchy organization, saw membership applications surge. Their CEO appeared on television programs across the country, arguing this was proof the royal family had become morally bankrupt landlords living off the suffering of ordinary people. But the most powerful voices were the tenants themselves. When journalists offered them protection and anonymity, more came forward. "I've raised 3 children in a home with mold on every wall," one mother said, her voice breaking. "And the duchy sends me letters demanding rent on time, every time. But when I beg them to fix the mold making my daughter sick, I get nothing." A grandfather in his 80s told reporters, "I served this country in the military. I believed in the crown. And now I'm living in a property owned by the king that's slowly killing me with damp and cold. It breaks my heart." These weren't abstract complaints. These were real people, with names and faces and families, suffering while one of the richest institutions in the world looked away. For days, Buckingham Palace remained silent. The public's fury grew with each passing hour. When the palace finally responded, the statement was carefully worded and, critics said, inadequate. The Duchy of Cornwall, now under Prince William's control since Charles became king, issued a statement saying they took their responsibilities as landlords extremely seriously and were committed to ensuring all properties meet appropriate standards. They announced an internal review of all rental properties and promised swift action where problems were identified. But they didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge the suffering of specific tenants. And they didn't admit to systemic failures. Legal experts pointed out something crucial. The Duchy of Cornwall operates in a unique legal gray zone. It's not technically part of the Crown estate, and it's not a normal corporation. It's a private estate that exists solely to generate income for the heir to the throne. This means it faces less regulatory oversight than ordinary landlords. In other words, the very institution that was supposed to set an example was playing by different rules than everyone else. Public trust continued to erode. Polls showed a significant drop in support for the monarchy, particularly among younger Britons. One survey found that 58% of people under 40 believe the royal family should have their property holdings subject to the same regulations as everyone else. King Charles himself remained publicly silent on the specific allegations. At official events, he smiled and waved, but body language experts noted he appeared tense and uncomfortable. Sources inside the palace, speaking anonymously to journalists, described the king as deeply troubled by the reports and frustrated by the situation he'd inherited. But was he troubled enough to act decisively? That was the question on everyone's minds. This scandal revealed something much bigger than poorly maintained properties. It exposed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of modern monarchy. Britain in 2024 was facing its worst cost of living crisis in generations. Families were choosing between heating and eating. Food bank usage was at record highs. Homelessness was rising. And yet, one family, the royal family, controlled vast wealth and paid no inheritance tax, no capital gains tax, and operated under special legal exemptions. The King Charles scandal became a lightning rod for these deeper frustrations. This isn't just about mold on walls, one housing activist told a packed town hall meeting. This is about a system that protects the powerful while ordinary people suffer. If the king himself can be a bad landlord and face no real consequences, what hope do the rest of us have? The optics were devastating. Images of Charles at lavish state dinners, wearing priceless jewels and living in palaces, juxtaposed with photographs of mold-infested bathrooms and properties his duchy owned. These images went viral, shared millions of times across social media. The monarchy's defenders argued that Charles himself couldn't personally inspect every property, that these were management failures, not royal failures. They pointed to his decades of charity work and genuine concern for social issues. But critics shot back. If you profit from something, you're responsible for it. If the duchy generates millions for the royal family, they have a moral obligation to ensure that money doesn't come from human suffering. As of early 2024, repairs were reportedly underway on some of the worst properties. The duchy claimed to be implementing new oversight procedures. Some tenants reported improvements. though others said nothing had changed. But the damage to King Charles's reputation and to the monarchy itself may be irreversible for many Britons. This scandal exposed an uncomfortable truth. You can talk about compassion all you want, but if people are suffering on land you own while you live in unimaginable luxury, your words ring hollow. King Charles ascended the throne at one of the most precarious moments for the British monarchy in modern history. He needed to prove the institution was relevant, ethical, and deserving of public support. Instead, he's given critics powerful ammunition. The king who wanted to be remembered for his environmentalism and humanitarianism may instead be remembered as the king whose tenants lived in squalor while he wore a crown. But here's what we should all be asking. Is this just about one king and one scandal? Or is this a symptom of a much larger problem? A system that allows the wealthy and powerful to operate by different rules? Because if a king can be a slumlord, what does that say about justice, equality, and the society we're all living in? This story isn't over. The palace gates may be golden, but they can no longer hide what's happening in the shadows.